conferences have a life of their own, and a great deal depends on the initial structure, and much more depends on the chemistry. I see this one as developing extremely well. I think there's a lot of vitality. I think the initial planning was excellent.
I'm from Holland, from The Hague.
From Uganda.
United States of America.
De Brazil.
I'm from Seattle, Washington.
From Japan.
I'm from Zimbabwe.
Birmingham, West Midlands, UK.
I come from France.
New York, USA.
Scotland.
Calgary, Canada.
Western Australia.
Mr. Aiton, Mr. Whitfield, Mr. J, honored guests, distinguished delegates, fellow participants, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the 21st International Conference on Social Welfare, and welcome to Brighton.
Over 1,500 delegates from 64 countries met in Brighton this year for the 21st International Conference on Social Welfare. The discussion centered on the responsibilities of governmental and voluntary organizations under the General Conference theme of Action for Social Progress. We asked Peter Jay, chairman of the British National Council for Voluntary Organisations, what he expected of the conference.
Well, what I think the conference is for voluntary organisations, both in Britain and from all over the world, to go on asking themselves the all-important question, what should we be doing in the modern world? And that's partly a matter of defining the problems in the world and the issues, and partly a matter, as we were trying to do in this session this morning, of asking, and what is the role of voluntary bodies and charities alongside governments, alongside business, alongside all the other institutions that make up society in that kind of world. It's also, of course, an opportunity for people to become aware of what's happening elsewhere in the world.
What do you see the importance of this particular conference as being?
Well, I think that the theme has been chosen 2 or 3 years ago, but it was a very good choice because we are now in a situation of economic crisis and of debating the welfare state. I listened this morning to my good friend John Pronk, and he made a link between economic development in the world, especially in the developing countries on the one side, and the role of voluntary organizations on the other one.
Try to compare the present international economic crisis with the one of the 30s. In my view, and I mentioned a couple of reasons, the present crisis is deeper, more intense than the crisis of the 30s. In the 30s, anyway, there was an answer. Western countries, especially the UK, the United States, others followed, created a new system, new forms of international cooperation, International Monetary Fund, the Bretton Woods system, GATT, OECD, the UN in a way also. The present crisis is asking for such an answer also. It's not being provided at the moment. And that is why, at the moment, the situation is, I would say, worse than at the end of the 1930s.
We know the world is going to be in crisis. We're going to be in a position to identify what the elements of that crisis is. We're going to want to spell out the various perceptions that people have of social welfare and its contribution to rebuilding a world in crisis. And we want to identify our responsibilities in achieving that goal.
Throughout the conference, a consensus emerged that growing economic and political upheaval would put an added pressure on social welfare agencies in both the governmental and voluntary sectors. The next conference in Montreal will be devoted to this theme in particular. This year's discussion was mainly about what the two groups can and can't do in response to existing problems.
It's a new problem. We have experienced this problem, although people have been moving from place to place.
Professor Herman Stein spoke about the different functions of voluntary organizations.
Well, I was trying to separate out three functions which often have been pulled together because terms are used very loosely. These three functions have to do, one, with what I've termed relief, repair, and maintenance as one kind of function, development as a second, and system change as a third. And that while they occasionally overlap, they're hardly the same. And I also argue that you can tell which one any groups are involved in by what kind of opposition they get.
Judging from what is happening in my own country, I think the voluntary organization has helped in a lot of ways to challenge the government and to bring into focus even those duties which the government have left undone. And I'm happy that in Nigeria, as a matter of fact, government has, on many occasions, taken this challenge.
And do you think in the 1980s we're seeing more of the third type of voluntary organisation than perhaps the first two?
We're seeing more of them, yes, and I think we will see much more in the future. It doesn't mean that all causes are necessarily good or one has to subscribe to them, but I think one has to be prepared for a great deal more advocacy. And indeed, that some of the agencies which now do not engage in advocacy because they are constrained to do so because of their relationship with statutory bodies or government may want to, when they feel convinced, perhaps stretch the boundaries a little bit and begin to move in that direction without turning themselves into advocacy bodies.
They try to, but in our case, it's the government who would take over the voluntary organization and use it for its own end, and this does not always benefit everyone. It will benefit members of a party. That again, we are totally against. Whatever we do is for the good, the common good of all, not for any particular section of the society.
I have noted from the discussion we've had both at this table as well as from the speeches and individual discussions I've had with other participants, that every government has some gap which is filled in by voluntary service. And the role the voluntary service is playing does vary to some extent from country to country. This, I think, is dictated by the economy of each country and the needs of its people.
I think that government should meet the basic needs of the people, and that volunteer agencies and volunteers in general should be able to concentrate on innovative methods and be able to enrich the lives of our people.
One of the traditional roles of voluntary organizations is that of being an advocate, of bringing pressure to bear on other parts of society, of informing people and changing attitudes. Without doubt, over the next 5, 10 or 15 years, we're going to have to make some severe and radical and extremely uncomfortable changes.
I think there is a place for all the non-governmental organisations, and part of that is lobbying and taking up and forming pressure groups and so on. But I think it's very good for the Red Cross that That is, we stick to our policy of non-political involvement. I think that our strength always has lain in that.
Terry Lacey, General Secretary of War on Want, had an opposing view of the role of non-governmental organizations.
I think we have shown that if you apply political pressure, you can achieve results and still keep going. The NGOs were vital in opening up EEC aid to Vietnam, for example, which had been stopped for political reasons. And we were also extremely important in pulling in resources from Western Europe to help Zimbabwe achieve its independence. And we are now doing exactly the same thing to help the Southwest African People's Organization in what will become Namibia. And it's only NGOs that can do that kind of combined political lobbying and practical project work. We're in a position to do that, and governments get into big difficulties if they try and do that.
I think that as we move into the 80s, in addition to this very long list of specific problems and new problems as well as the old problems of poverty, there is the voluntary organizations are involved in actually a development of our whole theory of society and how it works together with itself, which is not to challenge government or replace government or to substitute government, but to work in parallel with government, and very often in cooperation with government, both at the national level and the local level, in providing services and in focusing attention on issues which the traditional political and government mechanisms no longer handle adequately.
In general, the contribution of voluntary bodies is really to heighten the participation of people in affecting what happens to them. And that's a good thing.
We've seen that the delegates and speakers had different opinions on what non-governmental organizations should do and how they should do it. But most agreed that governments couldn't provide all necessary services and that cooperation and communication between NGOs and governments is essential. Thomas T. Uman of the Malaysian Red Crescent Society and Madam Letitia Shahani from the United Nations spoke of relations between voluntary, governmental, and intergovernmental bodies.
I can see that there will be cases where a non-governmental agency may have to get involved in the political arena, but I don't think that it is necessarily playing a political role, but rather it is getting to the decision makers and the top administrators and trying to get them to understand. We are fortunate that in our society we have the chairman and one of the vice chairman are ex-secretaries to the government, the topmost civil servant. Two topmost civil servants are there. There is a federal court judge who is a member. There are leading citizens of that type, although they are working in the governmental area. I am a government man, I'm also working in the voluntary sector. So there is, because of that, we find that this relationship with public and the voluntary sector doesn't arise that much of a, as that much of a constraint.
NGOs now must really contact their own governments and inquire what policies they have insofar as social development is concerned, how they articulate these policies at the United Nations and at subsidiary bodies of the UN. And NGOs should try to develop a partnership with the government to see to it that their concerns and their interests are made known to governments, so that these in turn are communicated at intergovernmental bodies at the international level.
To use the word the devil's advocate, I think that the devil should be due and the devil should be here in terms of more representation from government. I believe that there are many of the ministers in various departments from England around here, but it might have helped if we had representation from all of the countries. There are 64 countries represented at this conference, and it might have been good if you had your social welfare officer, whatever level that might be, at the federal, state, or whatever the political area is, to hear some of this discussion and actually meet the challenge. It's about personal social services. It's a question of, it's almost like a high building. You know, you take a high building where you have 100 floors, and they're on the 100th floor. And the guy who really needs the services is on the ground floor or your first floor. And very often there's no meeting. You know, everybody goes along a parallel track. And it's not a really understanding. And I think that perhaps the main problem when it comes down to what I would call the acid test is money. You know, what will the money buy? And then one gets caught up in the accountability.
Voluntary groups are accountable to the donors on whom they depend. They must be prepared to demonstrate, whether to the public or to a statutory grant giver, that they are using the funds they receive effectively for the purposes for which they were donated. There will inevitably be tensions and sometimes disagreements in this relationship between government and the voluntary sector. We can all argue about the best way to help people. There is often a very thin dividing line between diagnosing the ills of society, trying to respond to the needs to which they give rise, persuading the system to adapt or change its policies and priorities, and adopting what might to some seem to be a more appropriate step, trying to effect radical political change. We can argue how far this last is probable, at least for charities with tax advantage.
There's an element of social control involved here. In fact, the voluntary organizations act as social control agents for the government in many instances, and sometimes that's an unwritten contract. We're not so sure that all voluntary organizations that accept public money are aware of this unwritten contract and what it means to them. That is part of the inherent tension between the voluntary and the public sector.
10, 20 years ago, organizations, NGOs, used to raise money by rattling cans and fairly labor-intensive methods like jumble sales. It's much harder to do this now in the middle of a recession where we've got high unemployment and a lot of poverty inside Europe, and therefore we need much higher level fundraising techniques inside the NGOs to keep them going, not just advertising and marketing, but institutional fundraising. What makes us acceptable to governments and institutions like the EEC is the fact that we value our independence and we're not just there to be their intermediaries.
As well as focusing on the central theme of voluntary and governmental responsibilities, the conference provided a forum for discussion on many major issues. These included work with the disabled, serving the aged, and the plight of refugees. Amongst the many distinguished speakers was Maurice Foley of the EEC talking on the European community, NGOs, and the Third World.
The question is, do we in the developed world recognize the vulnerability of these countries who are dependent on commodity? And do we really take into account the fact that their economy depends on this? But in time, if the industrial world ignores the plight of the poorer nations of the world, then you have the ingredients for revolution. And this is part of a collective concern that we should all have.
Professor Oliveira of Brazil spoke on rural development.
Yo he mostrado como las cooperativas, las agroindústrias y las empresas de colonización han hecho un trabajo muy bueno para mejorar el nivel de vida de los campesinos.
Rosalind Ford of the Ministry of Social Welfare, Sierra Leone, and Ida Gindi, Director for Europe of UNICEF, chaired the session on the situation of children today and in the future. Many speakers, too numerous to mention, made significant contributions to the diverse conference debate. Delegates voiced their opinions in small group discussions. We asked them what they thought were the vital issues in social welfare today.
Well, I'm thinking of standards, spiritual standards as well, a faith.
I wish that governments, and I'm speaking primarily of the United States government since that's who I work for, was more responsive to the needs of poor people.
The necessity of cooperation between public and private sectors must be emphasized more years to come.
I don't think that government can comprehend the full weight of the need for personal and social care unless it itself confronts some of the administrative, financial and professional problems that are involved in delivering care. But I'm very far from believing that government should have a monopoly of direct service provision.
I think it's interesting, but it's also a bit dangerous to discuss the role of voluntary organizations in a time of economic constraint, because the danger is The governments think now they can find financial help from the voluntary organizations, and in other times they do all what is to do by their own.
The fact that you see the president of a voluntary organization included in the government delegation, in the Indian delegation, at the international conference, shows that there is partnership between the government of India and the people of the country who are encouraging, supporting, and strengthening voluntary organizations at the various sectors, grassroots sectors.
We deal with the most critical social and economic problems in the world, that we go on record stating that the United States, for one, and some of the other powerful countries sit down and talk, one, about the world economic situation and unemployment and nuclear warfare.
Survival and social welfare should be our main considerations, and getting a strategy that will really impact is really our major concern.
It's necessary that we try and show that there are practical solutions to these very major problems we're all grappling with, that you can do something, that individual people can stand up against governments or multinational companies, for example, and get some results. And the NGO movement doesn't really have the right to exist if it doesn't believe that that's true.
Throughout the conference, the discussion moved from these formal sessions into the corridor conversations of informal networks.
Well, you know, conferences have a life of their own, and a great deal depends on the initial structure, and much more depends on the chemistry of what happens after that, on who's there and what the communications are that are outside of the meetings themselves.
John Bishop of the Brighton Council for Voluntary Service was involved in coordinating these outside activities.
We've been concerned, for example, to make sure that the fringe facilities, those people who want to discuss things that aren't on the main conference agenda, that there's good facilities in Brighton for those. We've had over 30 meetings in the past week, over half of which have been planned while the conference has been going on. Now that ranges from various delegations to various interest groups, and some of the fringes have been extremely well attended.
Oh, I have gained quite a lot, because I met my old friends, made new ones, had exchange of ideas, and the participation of the volunteers in this field of development gave me many an idea to take back home for improving of our social activities.
Roy Manley, chairman of the conference committee, commented on the value of exchanging ideas drawn from personal experience.
You are inclined to get plenary speakers who speak at a very general level because they realize they have an international audience. But on the whole, those people who speak from their own experience rather than generalize, I think, are the people who get people talking. For example, last night, Sander Egbert, who received the René Sand Award, which is given to the person who is reckoned to have given the most distinguished service in the field of social welfare, an Indian, disabled, running a rehabilitation centre in southern India, speaking very much from the heart, and a man who works day by day with people. I think that a man like this, brings us back to what we're all about, really.
I am not a social welfare organizer. I am not a social scientist. I am a plain field worker. And tonight, I am speaking to you as one, and I am grateful for this opportunity. In that light, and in that light alone, I will be dwelling on the role of and the challenges before the governmental and voluntary organizations from the viewpoint of the developing world, particularly my country, and particularly keeping in mind the plight and problems of the handicapped.
We've really almost come to the end of the conference now. What have you got from it?
Well, I myself would think that since I have been attending these conferences quite regularly, I meet many old friends, and they are all delighted with this theme, and we have heard many good speakers. We have quite a lot of exchange in the groups. hopefully that we will come up with a certain report and recommendations being made to most of our governments, so that the governments, which more or less now are supporting more and more voluntary agencies as far as finances is concerned, that they would not control the actions of the voluntary agencies through the finances, but rather enhance and help them to promote their work, so that voluntary agencies can work together well with government to promote social progress as a whole.